Welcome. Thank you for joining this Zoom for a discussion of pathways to 30 by 30 and funding. My name is Melanie Schlotterbeck, and I'll be moderating this session today for Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. You'll see we are in webinar format on the Zoom platform. This means that the icons at the bottom may be a little bit different than you normally see. Today's content is being live simulcast into Spanish, and now our interpreter, Mercedes Merlot, will translate this introduction before being moved into the Spanish audio channel.
Sí, bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por unirse a este Zoom para una discusión de 3 itinerarios al 30-30. Mi nombre es Melanie Schlotterbeck y moderaré esta sesión hoy para Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks. Verá que estamos en formato de seminario web en la plataforma de Zoom. Esto significa que los iconos en la parte inferior pueden ser un poco diferentes de lo que normalmente ve. El contenido de hoy se está transmitiendo simultáneamente en vivo al español. Yo voy a estar interpretando en el canal en español. Y ahora yo, la intérprete, voy a traducir esta introducción antes de pasar al canal de audio en español.
Every slide has a yellow text to match the English version of content, and you'll need, if you need the interpretation services, please click on the globe icon and select Spanish.
Así que justamente cada diapositiva tiene texto amarillo para que coincida con la versión en inglés del contenido, así que si necesita servicios de interpretación al español, por favor haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla y puede seleccionar Spanish en inglés o español.
Should you need assistance with closed captioning, that's offered as well. Simply click the Show Captions icon. I would like to pause at this point because we had a glitch in our Zoom registration, and Zoom recommended we start over on the registration link. So we missed some of our statistics for our grant reports. So please complete the survey, which I'm launching now, to help us track these details. About 20 more seconds. All right, thank you. During today's presentation, we will be accepting questions via the Q&A icon. If you click it, you have the option to ask a question by typing in the box. If you want your question to be anonymous, you can click that. And the send arrow is on the bottom right. Finally, limited interaction will occur during the Zoom in the chat, as it is only being used to pass important information on to our participants. If you need to send something to us, click on the chat icon, type your message, and click send. Again, please direct all questions to the panelists through the Q&A feature. Today's event is being recorded and posted to the Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks YouTube channel. If you miss any portion, need to see something again, or registered but couldn't make it, this entire workshop will be available online, hopefully later today. Now that we have the basics out of the way, let me acknowledge that the state of California exists on occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. These lands have been stewarded by Native nations since time immemorial. These lands and waters have significance to the indigenous peoples of California. Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks work is focused on the ancestral homelands of the Ahachiman, Guanino, and Tongva Gabrielino people. We pay respect to the indigenous people whose land was forcibly colonized and recognize the importance of the tribal relationship to the land, past, present, and future. Today's workshop is brought to you by the nonprofit Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks, or FHBP for short, and we work to protect the natural lands, waterways, and beaches of Orange County, California. We're grateful for the grant funding, which allows these workshops to be made available. The FHBP team working on this webinar includes myself as the panel moderator. We also have Mercedes Marlowe as our interpreter and Yesenia Rivera, who's staffing the chat and Q&A and did considerable outreach for this workshop. This series is in partnership with the statewide Power and Nature Coalition, which coordinates the grassroots efforts for 30 by 30. If you've not heard of 30 by 30 and that initiative, let me give you a little primer. Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order N82-20, which set a goal to protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030. It's shortened to 30 by 30. It isn't just a California effort, it's a local, state, and international and national effort. The agency responsible for overseeing the implementation of 30 by 30 is the California Natural Resources Agency, CNRA. There are 3 pillars to 30 by 30, which include biodiversity, access to nature, and climate resilience. CNRA released on Earth Day, April 22nd of last year, a document called Pathways to 30 by 30, which identified 10 different strategies on how we will achieve funding. How we will achieve 30 by 30. Today, we're focused on funding. There are 3 state conservancies with us today, and we are grateful to have the experienced, skilled, and knowledgeable presenters covering this material. Let me introduce Greg Gauthier. He's the Deputy Regional Manager for the State Coastal Conservancy, South Coast Region, and he's been with the Conservancy since 2006. Prior to that, he was the Manager and Task Force Coordinator for the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project. He's a marine and wetland scientist with a passion for California's coasts, mountains, and deserts. He holds a degree from the University of Wisconsin and the Johns Hopkins University. Next is Rory Skay. Rory has served the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, SMMC, in several capacities since 1983. First, as a City of Thousand Oaks appointee to the SMMC Advisory Committee, then representing the County of Ventura on the SMMC board, then as staff to the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, and by 1998 as Conservancy staff. As the Conservancy's Chief Deputy Director since 2002, Ms. Skay oversees grants, acquisitions, park development and planning, partnerships with local, state, and federal governments, and resource protection of 80,000 acres or more of parkland that have been preserved for the public to date. Finally, we have Jim Karpiak, who has served as the Executive Director of the Coachella Valley Mountains Conservancy since May of 2013. The Conservancy is a state agency that seeks to preserve open space and conservation land in the Coachella Valley and its surrounding mountains, along with providing for public recreational and educational activities on those lands. He oversees the Conservancy's land acquisition, management and restoration work, as well as its grant programs that provide funding to local public agencies. and nonprofits that support the Conservancy's mission. We're delighted to have all three of these presenters here with us today. Unfortunately, our fourth speaker from the Rivers and Mountains Conservancy was unable to participate after all. Each presentation topic will have about 15 minutes to cover their material and answer a few questions. We encourage you to add your questions into the Q&A window so that we can track them there. And we anticipate plenty of time at the end for questions and answers as well. So don't be disheartened if your question isn't answered immediately. First up is Greg providing information on the State Coastal Conservancy's programs and funding opportunities. Greg, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, Melanie, and the Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks for this chance to talk about the Coastal Conservancy funding programs and priorities to help Californians achieve the 30 by 30 goals. Some of you might not be familiar with the State Coastal Conservancy. We are a state government agency within the California Natural Resources Agency, and we act with others throughout California to implement our vision of a beautiful, restored, and accessible coast. We work in collaboration with partners like you to protect and restore coastal habitats and working lands, to increase park space, trails, and other opportunities for public access. And through these types of projects to help build community and ecological resilience to climate change. We work along the entire California coast, in coastal watersheds, in the San Francisco Bay area, and in the Santa Ana River watershed. About 75% of the state's population lives within our geographic jurisdiction. Cutting right to the chase, over the 2022-23 and 23-24 fiscal years, the Conservancy has received about $750 million in funding for climate resilience projects and public access to the coast. That's a lot of money. It's an unprecedented amount of funding from the governor and the legislature to distribute to you all on your projects and help implement the 30 by 30 vision. The total amount of each of these funding allocations is a little bit in flux, and so don't take them exactly to the penny, but these are a good ballpark for the funding that is available for the entire coast. I'm going to go back just a second. The different funds each have their own expiration dates, and the climate resilience funds, that $175 million pot, have the most time to spend, 5 years to encumber and another 2 years to fully spend. Encumbering means getting it into a grant agreement with a project partner for a project to start. Some of the other funds only have until June 30th of next year, 2024, to encumber. So we are looking to move on projects quickly. We anticipate another $150 million in fiscal year 23-24 for climate resilience on the coast. These funds will be used on projects along the coast, including restoration of coastal wetlands and watersheds, beaches, dunes, bluffs, bays, fisheries, and other wildlife, and projects that build resilience for coastal communities, provide public access, and critical infrastructure projects. Examples of the kinds of projects these monies will fund include projects that protect, restore, and increase the resilience of coastal and ocean ecosystems and coastal watersheds, projects that address sea level rise, flood management, and wetland restoration, projects that remove outdated dams and upgrade downstream infrastructure to increase climate resilience, enhance natural sediment transport, and to improve wildlife and fish passage. We also support projects that build non-motorized trails of statewide significance. So a little bit about project priorities. Within the project types I just spoke of, there are several priorities that are considered in determining suitability for funding. The first priority is projects that consist of nature-based solutions to sea level rise and wildfire resilience. And the second project area are those that serve under-resourced communities. We also are looking for projects that can serve as models for other projects and projects that move the needle on coastal resilience, that are implementing new or innovative solutions. The funding is available for brand new projects only beginning the planning phase, or projects that have been under development for years and are in various phases of implementation. There are three broad categories that our work falls into. Those are listed here. The first category is enjoy the coast. Our work to help people access and enjoy the coast includes our Explore the Coast program, Explore the Coast Overnight, and our Coastal Stories program. These programs help communities that face barriers to accessing or enjoying the coast to have an enjoyable experience on the coast through day trips, overnight camping trips, and related outdoor education programs. For example, programs within this program area work with local partners to create new overnight accommodations like the Tijuana River Valley Campground shown here in the lower right. That's a County of San Diego park, and also projects that work to bring people to the beach that may have never visited the ocean. And finally, through the Coastal Stories program, to tell stories of historically excluded communities by members of those communities through art, live programs, and interpretive installations or exhibits. The second project area is to protect and restore the coast. The next three slides will give examples of these kinds of projects. We fund projects to restore tidal wetlands shown here, such as the San Diego Bay. We restored historical salt ponds back to tidally influenced salt marsh. And this greatly increased the habitat value for wildlife and fisheries, as well as improving water quality and flood abatement properties in this area. Restoring coastal habitats like Ormond Beach in Ventura County, which is an area with many lower income people who don't have access to the beach right in their own backyard, is another example of a project where we're working with the community to restore healthy impacted habitats, restore the beach, dunes, and wetlands, and create access for the local community. Matilaha Dam on the Ventura River is a third example of a project to protect and restore the coast. We're funding pre-dam removal work, so work that's happening before the dam actually comes down, including land acquisitions and bridge construction. Taking down this dam is going to free the headwaters of the Ventura River, help support southern steelhead recovery, and deliver sediment locked behind the dam to the beaches on the coast. Our third program area is our Climate Ready program. That program aims to help communities deal with our climate crisis. Our Climate Ready program funds a variety of projects, including managed retreat projects that also restore habitat and protect public access, like the Surfers Point Managed Retreat program in Ventura, where an eroding bike path and parking area were moved farther from the beach, and the beach habitat was restored with the creation of dunes and the use of natural cobble to help stabilize the beach. We provide funds to create climate resiliency plans and plan new park spaces for vulnerable communities such as Barrio Logan on San Diego Bay. Additionally, our wildfire resilience program provides funds for capacity building, vegetation management, prescribed burns, and other activities to reduce the risk of wildfires, including projects like Fuels Reduction Project on the Paula Band of Mission Indians Reservation in East San Diego County. I want to talk a little bit about the application process and how you can access these funds to implement your projects. And then some new resources the Conservancy has developed to assist potential grantees in making the process clearer and more efficient. First off, applications can be submitted on a rolling basis and will be accepted and evaluated when they're received. So you don't have to wait for a request for proposals to submit a project idea. You can do that anytime throughout the year. The application is generally a two-step process. The first is a pre-application or pre-proposal that's screened for several factors. And then a second step is the by invitation only full application. So if needed before submitting a pre-proposal, you're welcome to contact our regional manager. Her name is Megan Cooper for the South Coast region. The South Coast region includes Ventura, Los Angeles, Orange, San Bernardino, Riverside, and San Diego counties. And you can contact her by email or give her a phone call with your quick elevator speech of what your project's about, and she'll help you determine whether it's suitable for one of our funding sources and it would be appropriate for you to submit a pre-proposal. Your pre-proposal will then be evaluated by Megan and other staff from the South Coast region, and you'll get an answer within 60 days as to whether you're being invited back to submit a full proposal. Once you submit the full proposal, you will also be responded to within 60 days. So who is eligible to be a project proponent? Public agencies, federally recognized tribes, nonprofits with 501c3 status, and non-federally recognized tribes that have a fiscal sponsor, such as another nonprofit or other entity. Typical grants range from $200,000 to $5 million, but there's no set minimum or maximum. Allowable project activities include planning projects, implementation, or what's often referred to as construction, restoration, or renovation projects, and land acquisition projects. We generally can't fund research, operations, and maintenance costs, ongoing long-term monitoring, one-time events, or endowments. A little bit about the project selection criteria. Conservancy staff will evaluate applications based on the project selection criteria, and during that application review process, you might be asked to provide additional information or sort of an application interview, or to host a site visit to your project just to help staff better understand exactly what it is and help you hone that project so it's the best fit for the funding source priorities, the Conservancy's strategic plan goals, and whether those benefits of the project will be sustainable over the long term. Are they going to be sustainable in light of sea level rise and climate change? Also equally important in our project selection criteria is whether your project includes a serious effort to engage tribes. And that means not just having tribal members as participants for a program on your, but actually involved in helping plan the project and be involved in helping shape what the project will look like, and perhaps a role for the tribes with co-management or even land back opportunities. Also looking at whether the project was planned or will be planned with meaningful community engagement and has broad community support, and whether this is a multifaceted, multi-benefit project. Have you looked at all the angles so that it's the best project possible? Trying to advance. Here we go. Conservancy staff have prepared a slew of new guidance resources to help clarify our application process and to streamline the steps for applying for a grant. So there are on our website under the grants page, a grant application guide of the pre-application template, which is very easy. It's about 2 pages long. That again is just your elevator speech, so you can find out whether your project fits our funding programs and our priorities. And then you'd be invited to complete a full application, which is a little bit more onerous, to be honest, but it provides all the details. But you have this pre-application process beforehand so that you can determine whether it will be worth your time to do the full application. We also have links on the grants page to technical assistance webinars, so you can look at other videos and things to help you in preparing your grant. One of the things we want to say is don't assume you need multiple funders. Some agencies require match for their grant programs. We do not. Or if you're already working with an agency and they're funding you, don't assume that you can't get more money from that agency. It's much simpler to do a project with funding from one agency than multiple agencies and multiple reporting requirements. And again, going back to the first slide, this is an unprecedented amount of funding for coastal resilience that have come to the Conservancy, and we want to distribute that money to you, help you implement your projects, and help California achieve its 30 by 30 goals. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Greg. That was a great overview of the Coastal Conservancy's funding and program priorities. There is at least one question, that looks like maybe 2 in the Q&A box. So I'll pause and let folks continue to type their questions. And if we don't get to them now, we can get to them later. One question that popped up from Dennis Baker is acquisition funding for coastal wetlands at risk of loss qualify for 30 by 30 money?
Yes. Short answer, but yes.
We appreciate short answers because we can get to the question.
That would be a great project. We absolutely want to preserve and protect coastal resources.
Thank you. Another question that popped into my head when you were listing the counties in Southern California
Yes.
that are part of the coast as it's defined. So it included San Bernardino. Can you give us a little bit of information on how the coast is defined?
Yes, I certainly can. Coast includes the coast and coastal watersheds, but the Santa Ana River watershed is in a particular watershed near and dear to the Coastal Conservancy because there was a move to create a separate conservancy for the Santa Ana River watershed, and that was at a time that state government was not enthusiastic about creating new conservancies. And so as an alternative, they created the Santa Ana River Conservancy program within the State Coastal Conservancy, which authorizes us to work within a ½ mile of the Santa Ana River main stem and its tributaries. So over 700 miles of river and tributaries, a ½ mile on either side of those. So that reaches all the way from the San Bernardino Mountains to the coast at Huntington Beach.
That's a lot of mileage. Thank you for clarifying that. Another question specifically relates to grants and disbursement. It sounds like there's a cutting the green tape initiative with the Coastal Conservancy because it sounds like a pretty quick turnaround in terms of whether or not you proceed on to the proposal phase and then review of that proposal. But what about actually getting the money? Is it a reimbursement grant? Is it a lump sum? How long does that take to come through?
The process generally from pre-proposal to taking it to our board for authorization is about a 6-month process, because there's a pre-application review, full application writing and review. And we are, for example, for our September board meeting, and we meet about 4 or 5 times a year. For our September board meeting, our staff recommendations, which are the report that we prepare for our board to analyze and authorize funding, are due in late June, early July. So in order for a staff person to be able to write that, we need to have all the information about your project, all of the CEQA status and those, because if it's a project, you know, CEQA is not required for a planning project, but for any implementation project, we have to make CEQA findings on your project. So in order to do that, we need completed CEQA documents before we can start writing a staff recommendation. I'm stressing that one because that's often people come with a project idea and they say, well, we're doing CEQA right now and it'll be wrapped up, you know, by August. So can we take this to the September board meeting? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We need a longer time frame for our staff and our attorneys to review the CEQA document and make sure that we agree with the findings.
Great. And another question in the Q&A is the URL for the grant application. Folks could probably go to scc.ca.gov, right?
That's the short answer. And then once you get there, click on the grants page and everything's on there. And there's a lot of resources on there. So don't miss those. There's a guide to the application also, in addition to the application template. And then, like I said at one point in the presentation, you can pick up the phone or email Megan, myself, or Kara Kemla, who's the other deputy regional manager for the South Coast. All 3 of us can answer your questions.
Excellent. Well, at this point, we'll go ahead and move on to Rory Skay and her presentation on the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. We're going to learn a little bit about funding and programs there. So Rory, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I appreciate it. So I am the Chief Deputy Director of the Conservancy. I call this Santa Monica Mountains 101 just because it's sort of a preview of what we do. It was established in 1980. We are a state agency under the Resources Agency. And it was originally intended to be a temporary agency of only 3 years to assist the National Park Service in achieving land acquisition for the then newly formed Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. But we have been extended, and in the early 1990s, we're finally made a permanent state agency. So let me advance here. So here's our mission, been longstanding mission that we, alliances, partnerships, joint powers authorities, we aim to buy back, preserve, protect, restore, enhance Southern California in order to make an interlinking system of urban, rural, and river parks, open space, trails, wildlife habitats. And this is key, that are accessible and usable by the public. We are required in our statute to provide public recreational opportunities to our parks. We don't close them out. So we're actually over 85,000 acres at this point, inching up towards 100,000 acres, but this is all property. We don't own it all, but it's been properties that we have either through grants or partnership protected over the years. So this shows our statutorily established zone. It includes what's called the Rim of the Valley Trail Corridor. So the Santa Monica Mountains proper stretches from Point Mugu in Ventura County all the way downtown past Griffith Park to Alvaro Street and beyond. And then over the years, we had various legislators saying, we want you to help us in our communities in the North San Fernando Valley and Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena, Santa Clarita to achieve the same kind of projects that we were doing in the Santa Monica Mountains. So it's been amended a number of times, but we include the Upper Santa Clara River watershed and the Upper Los Angeles River watershed. Goes up into Angeles National Forest, so that's overlapping there. And also includes the San Fernando Valley as far as one of the bond measures. Here's our park information map, and everything in green is not ours, but it combines all the publicly owned parkland in our zone, whether it's National Park Service, state parks, Forest Service, counties, other joint powers authorities, and land owned directly by the Conservancy. And then partnerships are probably the main reason we've been able to get as far as we have over the 40 plus years we've been in existence. Our primary partner is a joint powers authority called the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, or MRCA. The Conservancy has only 6 staff people. The MRCA has park rangers, fire staff, park planners, landscape architects, maintenance staff. That's really the backbone of how we are able to take care of properties. But we've also formed other JPAs with other local governments in Moore Park, Ventura County, the Whittier, the Wildlife Corridor Conservation Authority, which is down in both Orange and Los Angeles counties, and the Whittier Puente Chino Hills. That was established to use money that was established in LA County Proposition A. And there's been a number of achievements there. We also have a partnership with the Antelope Valley Resource Conservation District, which has a huge area. So MRCA can acquire properties up in the Antelope Valley next to the State Parks Poppy Preserve and beyond. So our main goals are land acquisition. So obviously adding to 30 by 30, and I think we've had a good head start on that, continuing with land acquisition, big properties and small. Project planning and design, that actually helps assist in eventual land acquisition or park improvement projects. Improvement projects like developing a park, doing river restoration along the LA River. Fire resiliency, and we were lucky to get big general fund grants 2 years ago for fire projects, which we've almost entirely granted out at this point. LA River has been a priority project area since the early 1990s, and we have a number of both parks and planning projects along the river. Coastal access, along with Greg, there are a number of properties that we have acquired either through the grants from the State Coastal Conservancy or the Coastal Commission, and we're trying to open those up for public recreation. And public recreation trails are a big part of what we do and a very popular component of our mission. So just some examples of the Hidden Creeks at the top photo is a big property in the Santa Susana Mountains, north of the 118 freeway between Simi Valley and the San Fernando Valley. Calabasas Peak in the Santa Monica Mountains. The Jochen Ranch, which is a huge property that borders both Ventura and Los Angeles County, north of the 118 in the Santa Susana Mountains. And these are all part of a linkage system. So other big acquisitions that we've made over the years, this is a property in Pacific Palisades, just off Sunset Boulevard, super accessible by bus and it's a gateway into Topanga State Park, but it's a historic property because it had facilities built in the 1920s for the Chautauqua Circuit. So it now provides cabins. People can rent cabins or have conventions there in the property or just hike. There we go. Another very popular property that was acquired over the years is the Los Angeles River Center and Gardens, which is downtown LA near the confluence of the Arroyo Seco and the LA River. This was formerly called Lowry's California Center. It was basically a restaurant and a venue for promoting their spices. There was a factory on the site. It was going to get all torn down and developed into a Home Depot and a strip mall. And through some very adroit assembling of various funding sources, we were able to acquire it. And it now is a very popular hub for community events. We have offices there. A number of nonprofits also are staged there. The National Park Service Rivers and Trails Group has offices there. And there are weddings and events every single weekend. And that is important because the Conservancy gets no funding for maintaining any of the properties it acquires. The MRCA is the revenue engine. It has to make money in order to operate all its parks and the Conservancy's parks. Franklin Canyon is another historic site in the heart of the Santa Monica Mountains between Studio City and Beverly Hills. It has Department of Water and Power reservoirs. William Mulholland was part of the origin of this park. We share ownership with the National Park Service and DWP. And of course, the Los Angeles River Taylor Yard, or the G2 parcel at the bend of the river, is a multi-partnership activity to try to, we've acquired the land thanks to other funding sources like Wildlife Conservation Board. And we're in a partnership with City of Los Angeles and state parks to both clean up the site because it was a former rail yard and also create parkland on the site. Other improvement projects that over the years that we're very proud of, the Augustus Hawkins Natural Park at Compton and Slauson Avenues in south of Los Angeles that we built in 2000. It was a former pipe yard for DWP. We've turned that over to the City of Los Angeles Department of Recreation and Parks. Vista Hermosa Natural Park, which is downtown. It's on school district property, but we essentially restored and created a whole new natural park in the heart of downtown LA. It was the first, before Grand Park was developed, it was the first park built in Los Angeles downtown in over 100 years. We did it in 2007, so the before and the after scenes. It's been featured in a lot of commercials. That view of the downtown is quite popular. And then our river projects, the legislature had us create a plan, the Upper Los Angeles River and Tributaries Revitalization Plan, which was adopted 3 years ago, and a number of implementation projects were identified in disadvantaged communities, severely disadvantaged communities, and up into the watershed. So we have a number that have already been completed. Marsh Street on the river, Lewis McAdams Riverfront Park, another popular spot. Little pocket parks like Steelhead Park, Oso, and Egret Park are on the bikeway on the LA River and are great stopping points for people that are recreating. And beyond that, our MRCA Rangers created a kayak program about 10 years ago on the river. A lot of people don't realize there's natural bottom portions of the river. This is in the upper picture with the kayaks is in the Sepulveda Basin part of the river. It looks like a bayou, and a lot of folks have, they can rent kayaks or go on one of our tours that we've done a number of elected officials through the area. But having riverfront parks meant we needed to assist LA Fire Department with swiftwater rescues. Anytime there's a high flow, our rangers are distributed along the river to look out for and to warn people, homeless folks that are camping alongside, that they should remove themselves. Extending over into the San Fernando Valley, Pacoima Wash is another spot where the Conservancy has funded a great park improvement project and created a natural park. Project planning includes one of our huge projects right now is the Wallace Annenberg Wildlife Crossing at Liberty Canyon. This is a project that's been in the making for over 30 years. The Conservancy's original goals were for habitat connectivity, and we started buying property on both sides of the 101 freeway, which then facilitated the planning to create a bridge, a vegetated bridge over the freeway, and it's under construction right now as we speak. It's a partnership with Caltrans and National Park Service and the National Wildlife Federation, a nonprofit that did the major fundraising goals. And so an over $90 million project with multiple funding sources, but we're very proud of this one. We hope to have it open by late 2025. The Coastal Slope Trail is another major planning effort. There's the Coastal Trail, which goes right along the beach, that Coastal Conservancy has been active in promoting. Coastal Slope Trail would be below the Backbone Trail, but also link a number of parks between Point Magoo over to Topanga State Park and actually almost to Temescal Canyon. And I mentioned fire grants that we had. Fire resiliency is huge for us. We have a big project along the 101 corridor on properties we own to remove flashy fuels and plant thousands and thousands of coast live oak trees, which are more fire resistant and to the wind-driven fires that come down the center from the mountains, from the San Gabriel Mountains and Santa Ana wind events. This is the area where the Woolsey fire jumped the freeway. Embers can blow over 10 lanes of freeway, so a fire break is not really much use, but if we can remove some of the flashy fuels and then also create ember screens with these fire resistant trees, that may be of help in the future. And then downtown, we have a little park called the Elyria Canyon Park, a walnut woodland that is a little oasis in the middle of development. And we have grants to the nonprofit called Northeast Trees to do a restoration project there. Coastal access, really important. We strive to get underserved communities to the beach in Malibu. And it's an expensive process, but it's been very, very successful, getting kids that have never seen the beach to the beach. We have a number of projects, coastal access sites, working on getting coastal development permits through City of Malibu, which is not easy. And we've reconstructed stairways at Malibu Pier. These all require coastal development permits, a long process. Lechuza Beach was a property that Coastal Conservancy granted funding to the MRCA back in the early 2000s to buy this property. And we've been planning and trying to get the access ways opened and improved for the last 20 years. I think we're getting close. We're trying to establish a restroom facility and handicap parking areas on this site. Another major property on the coast, but as will be a pathway from the Backbone Trail and the Coastal Slope Trail to the beach, Escondido Canyon. It has a waterfall that's been very popular when the rains come. And more public access. So the funding that we have been using to do these projects is Los Angeles County Proposition A and Measure A has provided funding. Proposition 1, Water Bond, and Proposition 68, with the General Fund Fire Resiliency. And then we're also a recipient of a Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program grant through CNRA and the Department of Conservation. So our funding is very much obviously at the whim of the legislature. Most of our Proposition 68 funding for just general purposes has been used up, extinguished, but we do have significant amounts left for severely disadvantaged areas and also projects along the LA River precisely. Our grant information page, if you go to our website, smmc.ca.gov, right at the top of the website, there's a link for grant information, and it has all of the guidelines for a Prop 1 grant or a Prop 68 grant, and our grant administration manual. Our grants are typically reimbursable. You have to invoice after you've done the project, after it's been approved. And we also suggest, before someone goes to the effort of doing a full application, please contact me, email me, and we can discuss whether it makes sense. We have one point to make is that we can only grant in our zone. So we would not have any capability of granting funds to an Orange County entity, but we can grant to nonprofits, local cities, tribes, and counties. And I think that sums it up, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. So one question that's already in the chat from Kent is, have you acquired anything in Orange County, or is that beyond the scope of your intended influence?
It is beyond the Conservancy as a state agency's influence. However, you may be aware that the former Banning Ranch, now called the Randall Preserve or Genja, between Costa Mesa and Newport Beach, was a big acquisition. Trust for Public Land did that acquisition and needed a takeout agency, and requested our Joint Powers Authority, the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, to hold the property until it can be transferred to another entity, whether that might be State Parks or County of Orange or some other group. So we have made acquisitions, but not through the Conservancy per se.
Thanks for clarifying that. Another question that popped up while you were presenting, it sounds like the Conservancy has been, and maybe it's also MRCA, has been creative in terms of how it's received funding, whether it's through state bonds or local propositions. Are there other funding sources that you're tapping into that might be different than what we've heard about already?
Interestingly enough, we've had a number of donations, unsolicited donations coming in. Usually they're not a big amount of money, but a lot of big land donations. And those clearly are very helpful. There's a couple of nonprofit foundations that have provided some big chunks of money for a specific projects and a specific park per se. And then the MRCA was able to create a community facilities district in the eastern Santa Monica Mountains and the Hollywood Hills area. And that has provided funding for both land acquisition and also for operations for ranger and fire services in those specific geographic areas.
Thanks for clarifying that. Greg had mentioned that they have a board meeting 5, sometimes 6 times a year to walk through their Conservancy's topics and grants. How often does the SMMC board meet and consider grants?
We typically meet once a month, maybe at least 10 times a year, so that it will have a quicker turnaround.
Excellent. And from start to finish, how long does it take somebody to get through a granting process with the Conservancy you're with?
Obviously, it depends on the grant, the scope, whether we have the funding available, but it could be as little as 2 months. It could be much longer.
Understood. Well, I will encourage the audience to continue to post questions in the Q&A box, and we will go ahead and move over to Jim. Thanks, Rory.
Good morning from the Coachella Valley, everybody. I'm Jim Karpiak, the Conservancy's Executive Director. We've been a state agency since 1991. Before that, we were a nonprofit organization. We have a pretty broad mission, just like the other conservancies, to protect the environmental, cultural, scenic, recreational, and educational attributes of our territory, which is the Coachella Valley and the surrounding mountains. More specifically, for those of you who don't know where the valley is, we're about 110 miles east of LA toward the center of the state. 1,500 square miles, roughly, is our territory. So it's a pretty large area geographically. It stretches from the Empire is on the west, in the city of Banning, to including the top shore, the top third of the Salton Sea, the area of North Shore. We're between Joshua Tree National Park and the San Bernardino County boundary. And then we go down to the Imperial County boundary on the south. And then also on the southwest, we go to the peaks of the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains, near the town of Idlewild, if you know where that is. Because of that geography, we have we're sort of at the confluence of several ecosystems: the Sonoran Desert to the east and south, going toward Arizona, the Mojave Desert to the north and east. The coastal range of mountains separates us from the LA area. The peninsula ranges that the Santa Rosa, San Jacinto Mountains connect down to Baja, Mexico. And then we're part of the Whitewater River watershed that flows into the Salton Sea. Because of all that, we have a real varied topography: desert, high desert, low desert, mountains, canyons, mud hills, alluvial fans, even transitional areas that have alpine features and receive a lot of snow, again, toward the Idlewild area. And we have a lot of endangered species, which has been our priority over our history to protect their habitat. Our mission, as mentioned, has initially, for the first 20 years or so, focused on land acquisition. We've continued that, but as state funding pots of money have grown, our mission has changed. From 2014, when we got Prop 1 money, we began working on watershed-related projects. From 2018, with Prop 68, we began adding recreational projects. And more recently, with some general funding, we've been able to fund educational and outreach programs. We've organized for most of our mission, our land acquisition work, around the Multiple Species Habitat Conservation Plan for the Coachella Valley. For those of you not familiar with HCP's habitat conservation plans, it's a regulatory tool for complying with the endangered species laws of the state and federal governments. Essentially, the community gets together and plans, the regulatory agencies participate, and they identify zones for conservation and for development. And in this way, they're able to eliminate the need for each project to go to the various federal and state agencies to get their permits. It saves a lot of time, and it is very helpful in terms of a long-term planning, so that there's not competition and tension between development and conservation. Back to that slide. The colored areas here are the 27 conservation or 26 conservation areas that we have in the valley. Each is set up because it has particular plant or animal species that need to be conserved and the habitat for them. The areas that are in the gray or kind of brownish are outside of conservation areas, so there's really no limit on development there. In the conservation areas, only 10% can be developed. The rest is set aside for acquisition, and part of our role has been to acquire that property that's private over time to the extent we can. And in I mentioned several species, 27 to be exact, that are protected under the plan. Several may look familiar to you. For example, the iconic Peninsula bighorn sheep in the second line, the second column, lives only in these mountains here and along the Baja Peninsula. It's a separate variety of sheep from the other bighorn sheep in the area. We're very proud of them. The Coachella Valley fringed-toed lizard, named after the valley, is the top row, the second column. Again, lives only here, and it has a really cool evolved feature of little kind of flippers or fins on its feet, so it can dive under the soft sand to elude its predators. And part of our task has been to preserve as much of the area with soft sand in the desert and prevent that from being developed. So there's a habitat for the species so it doesn't die out. At the bottom, you see another sort of iconic species, the Palm Springs pocket mouse in the last line, the 6th frame over there. That mouse has cool little pockets in its mouth where it can store food when it doesn't have any because of the weather in the desert. So again, we're very proud of the species we have here. A lot of them exist only in this part of the world because of the confluence of the ecosystems that I mentioned before. Again, for the first 20 years of our existence, we focused on habitat. We conserved over 109,000 acres so far between our work and our partners' work. With the funding, again, from a variety of sources, much like the other conservancies, chiefly California bond money, historically Props 12 and 40, more recently 84, and then more recently still Props 1 and 68, which is for non-acquisition work. We've recently got some general fund money that we're able to use for non-capital projects. And we can fund things like education or staff development to expand capacity of our agencies here for many years. And I know Rory and Greg will be able to agree with this. You get capital money from the state, but there's not money to maintain or to train or to educate. So to have these general fund revenues recently has been very important for us. We try very hard to leverage use of bond money, which our board controls, with other programs to make them stretch farther. Most significant there, I would say, is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Section 6 program, which funds the purchase of land that is habitat for endangered species. As I mentioned, more recently, we've had a little bit of a paradigm shift. When 30 by 30 became state policy, we began to have funding and impetus to look outside those conservation areas where the focus is on habitat conservation for objectives, to use for objectives like cultural preservation, recreational access, creating buffer zones for habitats so that the conservation areas aren't right up against development, land that helps promote smart planning and to reduce sprawl. So we're able to actively buy land that prevents development from going in. In some cases, we're working on projects where previously developed land is being acquired. In the past, we only sought virgin land, but one of our grantees acquired a golf course and they're looking to turn it into a wildlife corridor and a nature preserve. So again, with funding and state policy, our mission has changed a bit. One thing that hasn't changed is how we work. Much like the other conservancies, we work with partners. We own about 5,000 acres ourselves, including a historic ranch in the mountains above Palm Desert, which is getting us into the historic building restoration business, which is a new task for us. We work with cities. We work with the Coachella Valley Association of Governments. We work with tribes and various nonprofits, the Friends of the Desert Mountains here, the Oswett Land Trust, the Center for Natural Land Management, which may be familiar to some of you who are from the San Diego area. And again, our goal is to work together, and we've kind of become the de facto coordinator of conservation acquisition in the Valley, which really helps because we can reach out and prevent competition among agencies for acquiring property. And again, whether it's to tribes or to cities or to other nonprofits, it really helps to have some coordination going on. Turning now to our programs that we have that folks may be interested may be interested in applying for funding from. Eligible applicants, much like the other conservancies, public agencies, state or local, not federal in our case, tribes, and nonprofits with 501c3 designation. Applicants have to be in our jurisdiction or serve our jurisdiction or benefit our jurisdiction. So virtually all of them are within our jurisdiction, but in a few cases, we've bought land right outside our jurisdiction because it's part of the watershed, and the acquisition of that land benefits our territory. Or more recently, we're funding programs that may take folks out of our jurisdiction, but they're taking people from our jurisdiction. We are always seeking new partners. The Coachella Valley is an interesting place demographically. There's a lot of part-time residents. And a lot of retired residents, a lot of a big agricultural community. We don't have the dynamism, the same type of dynamism that you have in LA and Orange County. So we have fewer partners to work with, fewer well-organized or even not so well-organized conservation organizations. So we're always looking for new partners. So I encourage you to explore funding from our 4 grant programs. The first one is the Acquisition Assistance Program. Again, it's mostly to buy land, and we sometimes use it to fund grants that provide improvements to land, such as fencing to protect the land, removal of old improvements. In one case, funding to provide bubblers for sheep so that they were able to remain on the land in the face of climate change. We generally work cooperatively on the coordination of the land acquisition. So the applications come through consultation requests. There's not really a form for this. So if you're interested in acquiring land and getting a grant for us or improving existing conservation land, you would make a request to our office and we'd sit down with you. We have about $8 million left here for land acquisition work. And if there's a new bond in the next year, there will be more. Proposition 1, again, we got this funding in 2014 with the passage of Prop 1. It's used for implementing the California Water Action Plan in the Coachella Valley. Needs to be watershed related, but that's broadly defined. So restoration of watershed area that benefits endangered species works. Flood control, improving water quality, or preserving the supply works. Water delivery systems, that works. We generally have 2 RFPs annually. Grants have ranged from $20,000 to $1.5 million. We have about $3 million left. It's a 3-step process, typically a pre-application form that you fill out. Second, there's a consultation with us. And third, there's a submission of a longer written narrative. We have to have a CEQA compliance before we can make a grant, unless it's a planning grant. In some cases, we have made planning grants specifically to do CEQA for smaller organizations that can't afford to front that money. Moving to Proposition 68, again, this is focused on recreation or climate change projects, things like trails, parks, green infrastructure. We funded a solar composter for the Living Desert, which is a large zoo that has a lot of animal and plant waste that they used to have to truck very far away using a lot of gas and vehicle miles traveled and such. Now they're able to process it on site. Interpretive signing, all those kinds of things we can fund with this money as long as they're capital improvements. We have a continuous application process, and we have a priority for severely disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged communities being served. We have a preference for multi-benefit projects that meet several objectives and that are collaborative among several grantees. Grants range up to $500,000. We have $4.5 million left. Our last grant program is the Climate Resilience and Community Access Grant Program. This uses general funds, so we focus on non-capital projects, education, outreach, capacity building, similar priority for severely disadvantaged communities or disadvantaged communities. Grants have ranged from $50,000 or so to about $400,000. We just made some awards literally last week, and we have $1.5 million left this year. We're hoping to get another $9 million in wildfire resilience funds next year, so that may be available if the legislature approves what's been proposed. That's our very quick summary of our grant program and our program, so you may have a better idea of what may be eligible if you're looking to apply. All the guidelines and the RFPs are on our website. It's cvmc.ca.gov. We're happy to provide technical assistance and informal telephone inquiries are welcome. You don't have to fill out a form or anything first. Just give us a call, send us an email, and we will begin the conversation. So thank you for your interest, and I'm looking forward to answering questions now or by personal inquiries later on.
Perfect. I feel like I learned so much about a territory I was a little bit less familiar with, so thank you. One question that's already come in on the Q&A box, so again, I'll encourage folks to submit their questions there for both Jim, Rory, and Greg, because we will wrap this up here in just a moment. But the question from Kent is, has the recent lithium gold rush into the Salton Sea area prompted any concerns or maybe changes about habitat preservation?
Well, certainly concerns. We're very concerned about a rush to do sort of industrial level mining or things like that. It could damage the property where that's happening or the wetlands where that's happening, as well as it could cause kind of a rush of development on the land that otherwise is pretty pristine. So it's a concern. I think the state is aware of it, and I think the folks planning at the Salton Sea are aware of it. And so hopefully that will be respected by folks making those plans. Hasn't affected our grants yet. Most of the lithium work would be outside of our territory, but it could have a spillover effect.
Great, thanks for clarifying. One thing that popped into my head as you were talking about the potential budgeting for next year, I think you mentioned $9 million. In comparison to the other state conservancies, do you feel like you could use more money because more is happening in your geography and finally you're getting the recognition that you deserve, or not?
Hard to say. I mean, we're happy we've gotten more money, particularly the general fund money and the wildfire resilience money that may allow us to do more work on invasive species or shoring up some of the poorer communities' fire departments with equipment they need. We don't get nearly as much money as the Coastal Conservancy or even Santa Monica, but we're a smaller area geographically. Land is much cheaper here. I mean, some of our land is purchased for $500 an acre. I don't think any of Rory's is that cheap. So we don't have as much need for the high dollar amounts. We're satisfied with what the state has given us so far. Always happy to take more. I guess that's the best way I would have to answer it.
Excellent. And back to kind of timing and reimbursement versus lump sum, start to finish, how long is the process? And are you also more of a reimbursement basis than a lump sum out the door?
My answer is kind of similar to what Rory's was. It really depends on the project. We can move as quickly as a month and a half or 2 months, depending upon our board meeting schedule. Our board meets every 2 months. And for some planning grants or things like that, we can move really pretty rapidly. Others where there's land acquisition involved or CEQA involved, it can take 8 months, a year, that sort of thing. So it could take a while. Your other question, I'm sorry, was about was there a second part of your question?
Well, I think you answered it. Reimbursement versus lump sum and timing. I think you got it.
Yeah, we sometimes are able to make advances, particularly with the general fund money. We don't like to, but there are a couple of organizations that were really sort of bordering on startups or doing great expansions. And we gave them grants because otherwise, or advances because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to implement their project. So to the extent the law allows us, and that's a little complicated, but we do make advances where we can.
Great. Yeah, that's important. It's hard to, when you're a smaller organization, expand if a grant is on a reimbursement basis. So appreciate the flexibility there. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation slides so that folks can learn a little bit more about what's coming up next. And then this will give folks time to add additional questions into the Q&A box. So thank you to all of our presenters. Appreciate your time, your expertise, your energy. And again, type your questions into the Q&A box. If you don't know this, Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks is hosting a series of workshops, and every month, the fourth Thursday from 10 to 11:30, with the exception of November, where we're on the fifth Thursday, we will feature content related to 30 by 30 that helps you, your organization, achieve goals in aligning with the state's effort for 30 by 30. The June 22nd workshop includes transactional information. So it's the how-to behind protecting landscapes and waterscapes. And if you're able to, take out your phone, you can scan the QR code with the camera and then click on the link to register for this event. The link to register is also being added to the chat now. We have speakers from the Nature Conservancy, the Rivers and Lands Conservancy, the Sauls Company and California Land Conservancy, and then Terrell Watt Planning Consultants. We hope to see you there. If you want to be notified of future workshops, you can email us at community@fhbp.org and include your name and email address, and we'll add you with your express permission to our email list. Then I would also encourage folks to stay informed about 30 by 30 and the California Natural Resources Agency's work by adding yourself to their email list. They provide email updates with content related to grants, webinars, programs, public comment periods, etc. So I'm going to thank everyone for participating today. There's going to be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you fill out to better understand how we're doing or what we could do better. Hope to see you in the future. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go ahead and get to other questions that are popping in. One thing I'm curious is how groups should work with each of the conservancies. What's the best way to establish a relationship? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I'll go. I think just send an email. Send me an email, or it can go to grants@smmc.ca.gov, and happy to chat.
Great.
Yeah, I say the same, email or a phone call.
Same answer.
All right. Easy enough. What about priorities? I know that it can be difficult for state and public agencies to have a list of priority projects because it can be perceived as a taking by a landowner. How does somebody working in a nonprofit or a land trust or a tribe know that a particular geography might be really important to you? You want to start with Jim maybe this time, or Greg? Saw you unmute.
I'm happy to talk. Our priorities are defined quite well in our strategic plan. It's an easy read. It's available on our website. It was just updated, so it's a 2023 to 2028 plan. And that lists our priority project areas. In terms of our funding priority, most of our money right now is available for coastal resilience. So the project needs to incorporate that along with those other elements that we talked about involving underserved or historically unrecognized communities, tribal communities, and all those things that I listed on the priorities. But strategic plan is a good place to start.
Great.
Yeah, I would concur. Our strategic plan to actually just look at the map and see, is it in our territory? Does it have biodiversity? Does it have multiple objectives? Will it not just protect something from development? That's not our primary concern, but will it create or protect a habitat linkage corridor? Does it have specific resources like oak woodland? Is it accessible for public recreation? Is it close to a transportation route? Again, that probably militates more to just calling up and asking.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's the same. I mean, we are blessed at this point to have money in all of our different grant programs remaining. So we're not going to rule anything out based on the kind of things I talked about before. We too have a strategic plan 2020, 2025 that's on our website. I think in addition to the subject areas, you know, we look very hard at how feasible something is, how long it will take, and the potential benefits it has to the work we've previously done. We'd like to, as I mentioned, we'd like to complement the work we've done in the past. So if we can improve land that's already conserved or enhance the benefit of habitat land in one place by buying the adjacent property, we would want to do that.
Great. So does SMMC have a strategic plan that people may be able to refer to, Rory?
Yes, it's on our website.
Okay, so that seems like a really good spot for people to start in all three instances. Excellent. Specifically for Greg, and I'm just going to acknowledge I'm a little bit more of an inland gal than a coastal gal. So this question is coming from me specifically. The Wetlands Recovery Project list has projects identified and approved by a wetlands manager group. What is that list? Do you have to be on it to get funding from the Coastal Conservancy? What do we need to know about it?
That list is called the work plan, and the Wetlands Recovery Project is a group of 18 state and federal agencies working together for coastal wetland restoration in Southern California, from the Bight to the border with Mexico. Getting on that list, on that work plan, helps you become eligible for funding from any of those agencies that have grant programs. Some of them are regulatory agencies and don't have granting programs, but it's telling an agency like ours that your project's gone through a vetting process and has been evaluated by these different agencies and has some credibility because they have added it to the work plan. It's not essential to get funding from our agency or the other agencies participating, but it's helpful, especially in terms of coastal wetland acquisition and restoration. But for, you know, other wetland projects farther inland than that, it isn't necessary to be on that list. Does that answer the question?
It does, and I'll do a follow-up question. Let's say there's wetlands, inland wetlands, so not tidally influenced wetlands. How do folks just reach out to you or somebody with the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project to understand whether or not that project is fundable under a different goal of the strategic plan?
Well, the Wetlands Recovery Project, yes, it gets a little confusing because it is managed by staff at the Coastal Conservancy. So, but it's not just a program solely of the Coastal Conservancy. The contact in our agency is Katie Nichols, and she's the one that is managing the Wetlands Recovery Project for the Coastal Conservancy. And yes, to explore a project opportunity, you can email or call Katie or Megan. Katie reports to Megan. And yeah, there are wetland projects that are farther inland that fall under the umbrella of the Wetlands Recovery Project because they also work in coastal watersheds. It's riparian or farther upstream wetlands, and freshwater wetlands are not the priority of the Wetlands Recovery Project, but they are within their realm.
Got it. So one question that we've not quite covered yet, California has experienced, and even Southern California, a lot of wildfires, and this may apply more to Rory and Jim, but how does wildfire and extreme heat play into prioritizing projects or deciding to fund an acquisition?
Well, just about everything in Southern California is in a high fire severity zone. So clearly, there have been a number of properties that were otherwise proposed for development that maybe would be more suitable to leave open. And the fire resiliency funding that we received, the general fund, has been hugely helpful in the last 2 years. We've granted funding to, I think, 17 different grantees, cities, MRCA, nonprofits, to do both projects and workforce development. I mean, it's a long standing, it's not going to be solved overnight. I mean, we really had caught a break this last year with not a big fire season, but you know, it could be huge this summer. We shall see. So whether it's land acquisition or fuel reduction projects or workforce development to provide the folks that know how to clear fuel and not cut down desirable natives. I mean, that's all part of what we've been trying to do with the funding we had received.
Jim, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it really sort of expands our list of areas we need to conserve or may need to work on, because with more dryness or more invasive species, there's essentially more of a threat to the land that's already conserved. And then we have a pretty quickly urbanizing core here. Again, it's not as urbanized as some parts farther west, but for what used to be, you know, an empty valley, except for a small couple of communities and some agricultural work, you know, there's big, huge suburban areas now that are here. That changes the importance of acquiring some lands that previously weren't so important. So it kind of makes our task more complicated.
Absolutely. Well, I think I'll end on one question for all three of you. In terms of somebody in the audience, let's say, is applying for a grant with one of your conservancies, how are collaborations, so partnerships within a grant, maybe co-applications and matching funds, looked at, prioritized? Is it favorable? Is it advantageous for folks to do co-applications? Does it make things too complicated? And if they're bringing additional money to the table, do you see that as a better or an easier investment versus not? And maybe we'll start with Jim, since you were the last one to speak just a moment ago.
I mean, yes, and yes. I mean, it is very helpful when we have a collaboration between groups. They can kind of enrich what each other does, you know, in terms of their skill levels or what communities they reach. Often they bring with them some extra funding, so that in our scoring mechanism, each of those attributes would garner extra points. It's, you know, as I think Greg said, we don't require matching funds because we don't want to exclude folks that are too small or don't have the resources. But it does help a lot, you know, particularly at getting a larger project done.
Great. Greg, anything different to add to that?
No, I would echo what Jim said about matching funds. Although on projects, you know, that get into the scale of a $29 million project, matching funds are certainly helpful, because we don't want to spend all of. We do have an obligation to make sure we're equitable in our distribution of funds geographically along the coast. So we can't spend all of our 37 million in wildfire resilience in one project in one county, or we will have a lot of other counties knocking on our door and complaining. So that in terms of matching funds,
Great.
helpful on big projects. And then in terms of collaboration and partnerships, absolutely looking for those in any of the projects, in terms of community support, community partners, tribal involvement and engagement, and tribal partnerships. We haven't talked a lot about land back opportunities, but that is a priority for the Coastal Conservancy. And in those project areas where you have multiple groups with interest in the same area, same lagoon or the same bay, working out those issues among those groups before bringing the project together is good. That's not our role as an agency to broker between multiple interests, but we want to see those multiple interests represented or heard within the project that's being developed and implemented.
Great. Any final words, Rory?
Right. I mean, I agree with both Jim and Greg, and it's very impressive to our board when they're approving projects to see that there's a lot of collaboration or interest and support. So that's a big part of it.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We will go ahead and conclude the webinar today, and hopefully we'll see some of the same audience members and more at the next one. Thanks, everyone.